Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Teresa Cardinal Brown, executive producer and frequent voice on This Week in Immigration. In this week's episode, we're changing up roles and going across the pond to talk about the United Kingdom's approach to immigration and how that approach might change with the election of a new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, the appointment of a new cabinet, and the sad news of the Queen's passing. We'll welcome three guests: Liz Mair, a British-American political and communications consultant; Cris Ramón, global and U.S. immigration policy researcher and analyst; and Matt Dathan, home affairs editor at The Times UK. And our own resident Anglophiles, Ethan Plotkin and Hannah Tyler, will be doing the interviewing. A great episode to come, so stick around.
Welcome back. We're diving into the British immigration policy world this week at a moment of seismic change for the country. The Queen's passing 2 days after the election of a new Conservative Prime Minister, Liz Truss, sent shockwaves through the country and is emblematic of the turbulent time that Britain is undergoing. There's war in Ukraine that's led to spikes in energy prices and has worsened a cost of living crisis, with the inflation rate in the country now hitting 10% in August. To talk about how immigration fits into the politics of this volatile and quickly changing environment, we welcome Liz Mair, who tweets at Liz Mair. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you for having me.
So, first of all, how has immigration and immigration policy been part of politics in Britain? And what are the key divisions between the parties? I mean, we just had a Conservative Party election, but when the Tories and the Labour Party duke it out in 2025, what can we expect to see as far as differences?
Well, so I think that is a little bit in flux and a little bit to be determined as we head towards 2025, which is when we'll have to have the next general election at the latest. And part of the reason for that is we do have a new prime minister. I know that British media is very focused on trying to sort of ascribe a particular philosophy to her. There was a whole bunch of stuff about Trussonomics, just a few days ago after her elevation. I'm not sure any of that is really set in stone, not least because she is dealing with what is sort of a crisis, almost verging on an emergency situation when it comes to inflation and energy prices. So I think to some degree we will see. That's one thing that I want to say at the outset about the Truss side of this equation. Also, with regard to the Labour side of the equation, we now have a Labour leader who looks a little bit more like a sort of typical Labour leader. Previously, though, we had Labour being led by Jeremy Corbyn. And Jeremy Corbyn is very much of the old Labour type. He may not have come out and said that he was voting for Brexit. He may not have publicly taken a line that sounds very anti-immigrant and very skeptical of foreigners. But that sort of contingent of the Labour Party that he has always represented has always tacitly been understood to be of that element, right? They are much more skeptical and much more restrictionist when it comes to whether you're talking about foreign labor, whether you're talking about trade agreements, all of these kinds of things. And, Keir Starmer has obviously tried to move the party away from that, but I think there are a lot of divisions that remain within the Labour Party. And we don't really know how that's going to play out as we head towards the next election. So I think things are very much in flux, and it's hard to say. What I will also say at the outset is, I did work on the Conservative Party leadership contest. My client in that instance was on the Rishi Sunak side of things. Also, I did that work fully cognizant of the fact that I've always been kind of a Truss fan, right? So from my perspective, the fact that it was Rishi versus Liz was probably the best case scenario that I've ever had when you get down to a one-on-one sort of primary type situation. But that did put me in a situation where, I was looking a lot at the philosophies of the candidates, sort of what their consistency had been there and what their overall outlook and view was. And I think for as much as people are talking about Truss as being very Thatcherite, and I think that's true on a lot of economic policy topics, for me, the thing that actually has always stood out about Truss and was reinforced by a lot of the research that I was doing over the course of the campaign is that actually she has a lot more sort of, I think, classical liberal, or what we would say in the US system, libertarian undertones and inclinations than she does more traditional conservative ones. And so I think that's going to be different A, to what we've seen with the Conservative Party traditionally, at least as far as its leader is concerned, and B, probably frankly to what the Thatcherite Party looked like. And I say that as somebody who has been a big fan of Maggie Thatcher my entire life. When I was a very small child in England, before and right around the time of Thatcher's accession, I was in a position to be exposed, albeit at a very early age, to a lot of the problems that had arisen by that type of approach not having been taken economically. So I'm certainly not distinguishing Truss or what we may see in terms of Trussonomics from a Thatcherite approach in a way where I'm trying to, sort of do down Maggie Thatcher or be critical of Maggie Thatcher. I'm a pretty big fan, and it's pretty personal. But I think the overall point is, if Truss is actually in a position to move policy in the direction that I think she naturally would want to move it, and this is true of an array of areas, not just immigration, I think you will find that it goes in a much more libertarian, free market, traditional sort of liberal direction. The question is she going to be able to do that? And I think there are two big constraints on that. One is the current economic situation that you have in the UK. And the second is the direction of the party overall, because she has to maintain the confidence of her MPs. And that's where I think, the differences between the US and the UK become pretty stark. The US is still dramatically more pro-immigrant and pro-immigration than the UK is. I think the stereotype of the UK as being an island, you haven't had a lot of foreign invasions, things have traditionally been quite closed off. All of that is to a degree true. You certainly find just day to day, I think, out and about when you're talking to people in the UK. And again, I want to reiterate, I'm saying this as a British citizen. I don't sound very British right now. When I was in London a few weeks ago, probably more so. But as a British citizen and as an American citizen, doing the compare and the contrast, British people are significantly more skeptical of immigration and foreigners and that sort of thing than what you're going to find in the US. And so I think that's going to be a constraint on anything Truss may try to do that may look more pro-immigration.
And we need only look to the Brexit vote a handful of years ago to sort of understand this dynamic that you're talking about. I mean, opposition to immigration played a pivotal role in the Leave campaign for Britain to exit the European Union. Most post-Brexit analyses showed that immigration was the single strongest driving issue, in fact, for Brits who voted to leave the EU. How has that played out in the post-Brexit environment? I mean, did Brexit change the way that British politicians approached the issue of immigration? You talked about Jeremy Corbyn. Is that left flank? Have they taken on a sort of anti-immigration stance in order to match the environment, the voting environment?
No, I wouldn't say that that's what's happened, but I think that in the Labour Party, you've always had this, very hardline, hard left, old Labour constituency within that party. There's been a chunk of the party that's always been that. And, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown had to work really hard to modernize and address that on a number of fronts. And where that was most notable was when you talked about, you know, private ownership of property, right, or state ownership of property. It also was notable in terms of their dealings with unions, for example. But that modernization that they undertook to bring things to the new labor position that I think a lot of people in America are very familiar with, because you obviously did have the Labor Party in that iteration in power for quite a long time, that really entailed dragging a lot of the Corbynista types along, kicking and screaming, absolutely kicking and screaming. And so I think people forget that there's always been that undercurrent within the Labor Party. The sort of thing that I would say in the US system we see with a lot of the Bernie Sanders people. I mean, if you talk to a lot of rank and file Bernie Sanders supporters, they're really hostile to immigration too. They're definitely hostile to free trade, right? They're hostile to anything that they think is globalization. They're very pro-union. They're very pro-public ownership of a variety of things that probably the rest of us think should be kept, as private property, right? But you take that, you put it on steroids, and that's what you find with the sort of old labor segment of the Labor Party. So I don't think it's so much that Labor went, oh, wow, Brexit won out. And a major driver of that was people's negative sentiments about immigration. We better find a way to match that for our own political purposes. I just think they naturally reverted to where a big chunk of the party has always been. But as far as Brexit is concerned, it is interesting. Liz Truss and I, for that matter, we both voted Remain. We were both Remainers. But the reality at the moment is that I don't think that there's any chance that anybody is going to reverse Brexit. There's some talk that maybe you could put Britain back into some form of a common market. I don't think that there's the political willpower or support popularly to do that. And so Truss has ended up in a situation where, while she was against Brexit, she has been a champion of seeing the process through. And I think that that's an interesting position for her to be in. But I would also say, with regard to the Brexit point, yes, obviously immigration was a driver, and I know plenty of people, plenty of friends, plenty of family who voted for Brexit. And when you ask them why, you would get too many Polish builders. That was a very common refrain. Too many Polish builders, too many people from Eastern Europe taking British jobs. Whereas a lot of people who were anti-Brexit looked at that and said, yeah, and we want that because British builders have this like stereotyped reputation for taking 26 tea breaks, and then you pay £1,000 for something that should have cost £600 because they took all the tea breaks and billed you during that time, right? That was a driver for a lot of people with Brexit, but there were also a lot of smaller, weirder things that I think just really kind of stuck in the craw of people who never were fully on board with going into the European community or the European Union as it became. You have the constant refrain of people who were just pissed off that we used to have blue passports and then we had to have red passports. I mean, you hear that incessantly. Um, there were people who had a lot of concerns about financial services regulation that was being handed down from the European level and then sort of forced onto the City of London. The City of London, going back to medieval times, has always operated as sort of its own entity, not really even under heavy control of the government, the British government writ large, but definitely not under foreign control, right? So there were a whole bunch of things that people just didn't like, that they had problems with, and immigration was one of them. And as I say, I think that the British populace tends to be much more anti-immigration than the American populace tends to be. So of course you would see that in higher numbers. But I also don't ever want to be the person who says Brexit was about immigration. It was about a lot of things, and I think most fundamentally, it was about the fact that British people really, I don't think, ever have seen themselves as being European. And I'm not entirely sure that we're wrong about that.
Fast forward a few years to this most recent leadership campaign. Has immigration remained a wedge issue in British politics?
I feel like in this campaign, it's actually been less discussed than things previously. And maybe that's because when we were still in the EU and you still had Brexiteers sort of pushing for some form of referendum, which they ultimately got, that would be a major topic, and that would sort of catch up a lot of discussion about immigration and a lot of concern about immigration that you would get from the rank and file, voters out there, right? Especially Tory voters. Um, it also may just be that, with what we've got going on right now with inflation and cost of living, that's just not as high a priority. I think, relative to what we've seen previously, also in this election, you just saw a lot more focus on general people being upset with political correctness, right? Like there was a lot of focus in this campaign on people being anti-woke and fighting back against woke. I mean, that was specifically something that came up in leadership debates, right? Whereas here, it is a presence, certainly, and it is something that comes up in American politics, but mostly you see it sort of confined to debates on Twitter, right? Or, what people are writing sort of in what we used to call the blogosphere, or what's on cable news. Here it was really right at the forefront of it. So I don't really feel that immigration was put front and center in the way that I think it had been in some previous campaigns. But I also think that's partly because people regard the issue of Brexit as very settled. And I think the fact that we now have a prime minister who was not for Brexit, but now is prepared to see everything that remains through and is a champion of it, speaks to the fact that that is a settled issue now in the British voting populace's mind.
Last question to you, Liz, and sort of an abstract one. It's been a tumultuous few weeks. Obviously, the election of a new prime minister, which we've been discussing, the death of the Queen, Charles' ascension as king. The Queen was the sovereign of the UK for 70 years, really a steady hand. Does her death at all impact the way that British people think about their community, the political community? Will they become more insular or be more welcoming of the outside world?
Well, I think I think you're onto something, but not necessarily in the way that I think the question is phrased and that you may be driving at. So we've recently seen that there's been more of a renewed push for some countries that are within the Commonwealth to exit the Commonwealth, right? We've had that happen with one, we may have that happen with others. I do think that with the Queen's death, we may see that pick up steam because I think she personally was a unifying figure. I don't think Charles has established himself as such yet. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. I don't think anybody really knows at this point. But I think that that's a question. And I think the more that you have Commonwealth countries walk away from the Commonwealth, the easier it is for people to see, people of those countries as being that much more foreign, right? And that much less British. Now, in practice, I don't know how much that necessarily impacts what people are thinking about immigration policy. There are plenty of countries that have been members in good standing of the Commonwealth and have very deep running British connections. And when their people immigrate to the UK, they are treated as if they were as foreign and not related to the UK as if they had come from, I don't know, like Uzbekistan, Soviet Uzbekistan, right? Like about as different as you can get. So I don't know that anything necessarily affects that underlying attitude that you have within British society. I also think it's interesting because if you look at this with a historical perspective, the common perception is that we didn't actually have anybody who wasn't white and British in the UK until really relatively recently and with the expansion of empire. That's actually not quite true. Because of intermarriage and royal intermarriage, you actually did have people who, didn't look like your sort of stereotypical white person from the Midlands who, those people were actually walking around in medieval society. Maybe not to a great degree, but there were some of them there. So I don't think when you look at it, I'm not sure that I think that the Queen's death is suddenly going to kick off some new round of, people wanting to move in a direction that's very different from what we've seen and much more anti-immigrant. But I think you could see the Commonwealth weakening. And I think if you see the Commonwealth weakening and some of the member countries of it becoming less committed to maintaining the ties with the UK and with Britain, then in turn that will increase the sense that people from those places are that little bit extra foreign and probably make people, a little bit more resistant to immigration coming from those places.
Okay, so we're going to shift gears a little bit to one of the most consequential immigration-related decisions in the UK in the past year, the Rwanda asylum plan, which would send asylum seekers who arrive in the UK to Rwanda to claim asylum there. The policy was enacted by the previous government of Boris Johnson, spearheaded by former Home Secretary Priti Patel. The one planned flight of asylum seekers from the UK to Rwanda in June of 2022 was grounded last minute after a series of legal challenges. To discuss the policy, we'll welcome Cris Ramón, who tweets at @CRamonMigration, and Matt Dathan, who tweets at @Matt_Dathan. Welcome, Matt and Cris.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Cris, can you start by sort of walking us through the details of the Rwanda plan and situating the plan within broader developments regarding migration on the European continent?
So I think when you look at the Rwanda plan, which was introduced on 14 April this year, I think it falls in line with what you've been seeing both in Europe and in the United States with an effort to sort of have third countries serve as what I call an interdiction state, which is to essentially try to control migration for another country, such as Britain, that wants to send back migrants to a third country to have them processed for asylum. The basic rundown of this is that, you have a policy where individuals who are arriving to Britain through irregular routes who will be returned to Rwanda to be able to have their asylum claims processed. If their claims for protection are rejected there, they will have a chance to stay in Rwanda or return to their home countries. But they cannot return to the UK once their claims have been decided in Rwanda. Something that's important to note here is that, in this sort of general gist, is that the last British government did offer an initial investment of 120 Great British pounds into Rwanda to sort of spur economic development and to be able to boost the country's capacity to be able to receive these individuals. Why was it done? The British government stated that this was sort of needed as a deterrent against individuals who are arriving through irregular routes, that this is a better way of managing the migration flows, because in their argument that there was too many individuals seeking asylum, and that was a great pressure on the asylum system in the UK. Largely they said that this is a more effective way of moving forward. But like as I said at the outset, that this is actually something that, as a general trend, you've been seeing, both in the United States and Europe. When you look at Europe, sort of this whole strategy, you do have agreements, in particular the EU-Turkey deal that was signed a few years ago during that continent's major refugee crisis, where essentially the EU did pay Turkey to have a plan where they would be able to contain most of the asylum seekers who are trying to travel to Europe through the land routes in Turkey to be able to seek protection there. But that's just only one example. You have seen other countries, I'm thinking specifically about Spain, working with Morocco to sort of interdict and remove individuals who are traveling to Spain back into Morocco, to process them there. That's one important example. And other examples that you've been seeing countries such as Denmark exploring similar opportunities that you saw between the UK and Rwanda. And after that decision, actually after this plan was announced by the British government in Rwanda, you did see Denmark start more, really digging in a little bit more into sort of potential plans, including another potential agreement with Rwanda. If you pivot back to the United States, with the last administration under President Trump, you did see really good examples of this. I think the one that's clearest is the asylum cooperative agreements, where the United States signed agreements with Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador to send back individuals who sought asylum at the U.S.-Mexico border back to those countries. The only agreement that was implemented was the one with Guatemala. And it was actually short-lived because the administration pivoted towards the Title 42 policy, which is a healthcare, based in the healthcare statute, to remove individuals seeking asylum at the United States and allow those individuals to be more rapidly removed from the U.S.-Mexico border. But the asylum cooperative agreements really are a really good example of these sort of externalization strategies in the U.S. context.
Yeah, so could you talk a little bit more about the trend, the sort of general trend of externalization that we're seeing in the West, and why you think Western countries have moved in this direction in the past couple of years?
So, it's interesting because when you look at the foundation of international refugee law, there is a component around the idea of safe third countries, that there are some countries that a receiving state can send an individual seeking protection to another country, provided that the conditions there are similar and can offer protection. And the underlying theory is that you want to sort of have this opportunity in case an individual is trying to, quote unquote, venue shop to find the area or the country where they can receive the best level of protection, instead of just simply where it's most feasible for them. So there is that component of international refugee law. The issue, I think, what you're seeing now, though, is, and this is really tiptoeing up to the line of whether or not it's legal or not, is that you are seeing, countries basically finding ways to use other countries, other third countries, to be able to try to contain the movement of individuals, either individuals who are trying to travel to a country. The migrant protection protocols that the Trump administration introduced, for instance, that's where you saw the U.S. and migrants back to Mexico to wait for the duration of their asylum claims in the U.S. immigration court system. That's one where you kind of saw a country contain migrants. The EU-Turkey deal is another example of that. Or you have other agreements like we were talking about, both with the UK and Rwanda agreement and the asylum cooperative agreements between the United States and the three North Central American countries where you send individuals back. Those are sort of the ways that you've been seeing countries kind of skirting a little bit as to whether or not those agreements are fully legal. Because the question is, are they actually doing this in good faith of sending an individual back to conditions that are safe and commensurate that you would see in destination states in Europe and the United States? And so that, I think, is an open question. And this agreement between Rwanda and the UK has faced legal challenges, around the legality of it. I think, particularly with the Court of Human Rights, with the Council of Europe, that's where you've seen some challenges. And in the U.S. context, you have seen legal challenges against, the asylum cooperative agreements. You saw a lot of lawsuits against this last administration with their immigration policies, but that did face legal challenges as well. So I think that is sort of the question is, yes, there is a part of international refugee law that does allow for, sending an individual back to another country. But the question is the current slate of agreements that we're seeing and strategies, is that really contravening international human rights law? And that's, I think, a big open question. I will say one thing to conclude with this is that this is not necessarily new in the last couple of years. I mean, if you look at the U.S. context, you did see in the 1980s that the United States was interdicting a lot of individuals who were coming from Haiti and Cuba, particularly though with Haitians. And you did see them, did see the United States, sort of stop Haitian nationals and putting them in Guantanamo Bay, to sort of hold them and eventually return them back to Haiti instead of seeking protection. And I think that was really kind of the inkling, the first trickles of sort of seeing this kind of border externalization strategy. Obviously, it was on U.S. territory, but the thing is that you were looking at an example of where there was a sense of, we're going to stop asylum seekers from coming here. We're going to put them in detention of some sort or contain them and then send them back. That sort of broad approach, I think, is something that you are seeing now. Especially if you're seeing more individuals seeking protection worldwide. It is true that we are facing large movements of individuals trying to seek protection. Some of them may have better claims than others, but that is the vast global context. And I think the policy responses we're seeing now, we've seen hints of them before, but we're seeing them more clearly in response to these migrant flows.
Thanks, Cris. So I'm going to turn to you, Matt, and ask about Suella Braverman, the new Home Secretary, who has pitched herself as to the right of former Home Secretary Priti Patel and has expressed support for the Rwanda asylum plan in the past. How do you think she's going to approach immigration issues in general and the Rwanda plan specifically?
Well, I think with Suella Braverman, we're going to see not a very different approach to policy on immigration, especially illegal immigration and the channel crossings, but a different approach in the way that she operates as Home Secretary with staff and be much more conciliatory in that way. And we can go into that later if we want. Priti Patel famously was accused of bullying her staff. The top civil servant was forced out, etc. So she's made very clear in her first few days in office that she cares about their well-being and wants to take a much more conciliatory approach. In terms of on Rwanda, she's said to want to double down on the policy. That's one of the top officials told me yesterday that she's told internally staff that she wants to do. Obviously, she has to wait because of that High Court judgment that we're waiting for in October to actually to operationalise the policy. We have to wait and see for that. But there are other policies that Priti Patel attempted to put in action and has sort of enacted through legislation that she definitely supports. Among those is secure accommodation, and here we see sort of a continuation, but also different emphasis, I guess. Priti Patel was very hot on the Greek-style reception centres, of opening these large-scale camps, I guess, where asylum seekers would be put in very basic, simple, clean and safe accommodation, but just quite basic nonetheless. So they weren't that attractive, and they were seen as like stopping the pull factor of migrants who were seen to come over here and be put into hotel accommodation over the last 2 years, and seen to, the myth and the narrative was that they were living quite comfortable lives. I mean, the reality is something very different, but that didn't really matter when people smugglers are telling migrants, you get over to Britain and you're treated like royalty. So Priti Patel was very big on that, and she had announced plans to open an asylum centre in Linton-on-Ouse in a tiny village of about, it was about 700 people in North Yorkshire. And migrants would have been free to come and go there, so it wouldn't be a detention facility. What I've been told is that Suella Braverman wants to see a change in direction on accommodation, much towards secure accommodation, which in other words means detention facilities where migrants are actually detained and not allowed to come and go, or at least curfews are put on them. That will be very hard and challenging and quite controversial, because UK immigration law doesn't allow you to detain someone for the purposes of immigration beyond a reasonable amount of time. Now, that's not actually set out, and the certain time period is not set out in legislation. It's just a reasonable time. And that will face a lot of legal challenges if she does try to drastically expand that. But she is definitely told internally that she wants to see a change, a shift in focus towards secure accommodation. And then the third thing that she really wants to see is to try and see if she can reset relations with the French government. That will probably require Liz Truss to sort of do the same. There's so many different issues where UK and France have not seen eye to eye. North Ireland Protocol, she's wrapped up in all the Brexit tensions, among other things. That's not going to be a change. That's not going to be a change of policy or approach there, particularly because Boris Johnson last November, after 27 migrants died in the Channel, he tried to ask for border force officials to join French police in patrolling the beaches, but Emmanuel Macron rejected that request because he saw it as it would harm and impinge on French sovereignty. So she's going to see if she can reset relations with France, but that's not really a change in policy.
Okay, so we've mentioned the Home Secretary and the Home Office a few times here, so let's zoom out a little bit, and I'll ask you about the Home Office, which you cover for The Times, which is responsible for immigration, security, and law and order, sort of similar to the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice in the United States. So can you talk a little bit about the Home Office's responsibilities, how the office has changed in the last decade or so, and how it has historically approached immigration?
Yeah, well, it's probably worth going back to 2004. That was the big kind of the big change in policy on immigration in the UK, when Tony Blair's Labour government decided to immediately accept and bring in the EU's free movement of people, and he rejected the chance to implement certain controls and restrictions on the new accession countries to the EU, particularly the A8 countries, which included Poland and several other Eastern European countries. And that saw obviously a massive shift in immigration. So any EU citizen was free to move to the UK to live, work, and study here, and reciprocal arrangements were made, obviously, for UK citizens and across the rest of the EU member states. So that was a major change in immigration policy, and that has had a massive effect on not just immigration policy, but on our relations with the EU, and obviously had a massive impact on us leaving the EU altogether, because forward to 2010, the change of government and the coalition Conservative and Liberal Democrat government coming in, and EU freedom of movement had led to net migration reaching around 250,000 a year. David Cameron, the new Conservative Prime Minister, pledged to put a target on to reduce the net migration to the hundreds of thousands, so under 100,000, which he never managed to meet, and was widely ridiculed really across the political spectrum here in the UK, because as long as we were members of the EU, we would never have control of the number of EU migrants coming to the UK. Theresa May became Home Secretary, and that was hugely controversial. I mean, the whole idea of the hostile environment was to make life as difficult and challenging to live as an illegal migrant in the UK, which itself was very controversial, given that the number of illegal migrants was estimated between 600,000 and 1.2 million. So it's quite a large proportion of people who lived here for a long time. A lot of the Windrush generation were technically illegal migrants and had documents, but they obviously came here in the Windrush generation and some had never actually left the UK and didn't have passports. So when the hostile environment led to certain individuals being targeted for removal, that led to the Windrush scandal, and Theresa May's successor, Amber Rudd, was forced out as Home Secretary. And then obviously Brexit had a massive influence and impact on immigration policy, but wasn't actually implemented until 2020. So January 2020 was the first time at which the UK could actually control who came and went from who came from the EU. And under Priti Patel as Home Secretary and Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, we saw another big shift, I think. Boris Johnson is much more liberal in nature towards immigration. And while we, for the first time since 2004, had control over EU immigration, and EU migrants EU nationals had to apply for EU settled status in the UK, around about more than 5 million have done so, which allows them to stay for at least 5 years. We saw a much more liberal approach to non-EU immigration. And the figures, the first figures from that were released earlier this year, which saw that the big rise in non-EU immigration, 25% increase in work visas issued, 50% increase in students, and it's I guess a real success story for I guess the liberalisation of the immigration system in the UK for non-EU migrants. But some in government, particularly Priti Patel, was not overly keen to shout about that because the numbers were rising. The overall number of people coming were still rising. And then you also had separate bespoke visa schemes for Hong Kong, British national overseas passport holders in Hong Kong who were allowed to come to the UK for at least 5 years and apply for permanent residency here. We've issued more than 100,000 visas to Hong Kong citizens since the start of 2021. Obviously, Afghanistan saw 21,000 Afghans here, and the Ukraine refugee scheme has seen 123,000 come to the UK since March. So that's a quick summary of how we've seen the last 2 decades.
Thank you for that very impressive 2-decade summary. Can you talk a little bit about how much of a mark each Home Secretary leaves on Home Office policy in general and immigration policy specifically?
I think where Home Secretaries have an impact is more on the rhetorical and the general sort of attitude towards immigration, and it's for the leadership of the Prime Minister to set out the actual policy. So where you have Tony Blair setting out very welcoming and open freedom movement to EU migrants, you had his Home Secretary David Blunkett talking very tough on illegal immigration and asylum seekers. He back in 2003 he was talking about opening these big large-scale asylum centres that Priti Patel wanted to open, never actually came to fruition. And he also actually had plans to offshore asylum seekers abroad, which never came to fruition, which surprised some when we reminded people that it was actually Labour Home Secretary who first came up with a sort of a Rwanda-style plan. And then you had Theresa May under David Cameron, who was obviously talked about and oversaw the hostile environment, but very much tied to David Cameron's immigration policies and David Cameron's desire to stay in the EU and keep, therefore, freedom of movement, and wasn't obviously able to control EU immigration. And then under Boris Johnson setting out a more liberal approach to non-EU immigration and also ditching all those targets under David Cameron, he set Priti Patel the task of, well, we're not going to do targets in any kind of immigration policy, but it's your job to control illegal immigration. And you had countless number of promises and rhetorical pronouncements from Priti Patel about how she was going to do it without actually having any effect.
Can you talk a little bit about the mark that Priti Patel is leaving on the Home Office?
Yes, well, she came into the Home Office in 2019, July 2019, and 2019 saw Channel migrants. I think there were around about nearly 900 migrants across the Channel in 2019, and she left the Home Office on September the 6th. When more than 25,000 migrants had arrived even already this year. I think we counted it as almost 60,000 migrants have arrived illegally in small boats across the Channel under Priti Patel as Home Secretary. When she came in, she vowed to make the crossing, an infrequent phenomenon, I think it was. And shortly after that, she vowed to make the crossing unviable. So obviously her rhetoric did not match the action that she put in place. How much control she has over the Channel crossings is another question, but she certainly tried. You can't accuse her of not trying to crack down on those crossings, but it's I think she will be kind of looking back at a time in her Home Office. The Channel migrant issue and the Channel migrant crisis has dominated her time and really coloured her time as Home Secretary, when she would have wanted it to be a focus on recruiting lots more police officers and being much more tough on crime, particularly on neighbourhood crime, on shutting down county line drug dealing, which has really shot up over the last few years. And so she will be very disappointed that the Channel migrant issue has really tainted her time as Home Secretary.
Okay, so last question, and sort of returning to the future of the Home Office. Braverman was the first person to jump into the leadership race after Johnson announced he would step down. What does her short-lived leadership run maybe tell us about how she might approach her new position?
That's a very good question, and it was very short-lived, so it is quite hard to sort of interpret what she will do as Home Secretary, because she never, I mean, as we were talking earlier, the immigration didn't really play a big role in the leadership race, which was actually quite surprising given it's such a big issue with Tory voters especially. But what we do know is that she's going to be probably even more radical in her approach than Priti Patel, but she's just not going to shout about it. She's not going to make all these pronouncements and promising to do this and that, and crow about all her policies. We're told that she's going to let the results speak for themselves, which is very well saying that. But it's going to be challenging to see if in the short period between now and the next general election, which we're expecting in 18 months' time, in sort of summer 2024, if they're really going to be able to turn the tide on the Channel migrant crisis. So she's going to be much more radical. So not much more. She's going to try and be more radical on illegal immigration. She's going to try and shift the emphasis towards more detention facilities to try and detain more people pending removal to Rwanda or Albania or other countries that we've done micro deals with on returns. She's going to try and reset relations with France. She's going to take a much more conciliatory approach internally in the Home Office, but also externally. So I think we will see that with France. I think one more thing we heard a lot during her short-lived leadership campaign was the European Convention on Human Rights, which she pledged to leave the European Convention on Human Rights if she became Prime Minister. And what we've already heard from the Liz Truss government last week was that they've ditched any plans to reform the Human Rights Act, which implements the European Convention on Human Rights, because it's just too complicated. So one of her key pledges during the leadership contest has already been ditched. So at least before the next general election, the government is not going to be looking to tweak our relationship with the European Convention on Human Rights. What instead they will look at is more minor tweaks to immigration law, Whether that will impact the European Convention is yet to be seen, but I think it will be done more in kind of tweaks to immigration law rather than taking a sledgehammer to our relations with the European Court in Strasbourg.
Okay, well, thank you so much to all of you for joining us today, and we will see you all in 2 weeks.
And that's it for our show this week. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow me on Twitter at BPC_TBrown, and Hannah is on Twitter at HannahETY. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by me, Teresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Hannah Tyler, Ethan Plotkin, and me. Ethan Plotkin produces and edits our show. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.